On my 74th birthday, she didn't hand me a gift or a card. She whispered, "You're embarrassing," and turned away. Her words landed like stones breaking glass in my chest. And I rose from my chair in the reception hall without a word. I'm Eleanor Hayes, 74, and that was the moment I knew how invisible I had become. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. I spent the next hour wandering the garden terraces outside the old manor. The hum of laughter drifting past the tall hedges, the hedges trimmed to exacting perfection, reminded me of the way I clipped my own words all those decades. To keep the peace, I'd arranged flowers for this day, pressed linens for the tables, and baked her favorite elderflower cake. But none of that mattered. She had decided I was a spectacle, a relic better kept hidden. I thought back to every birthday, every milestone. I baked, I sewed. I held my tongue when disagreements threatened. When her father fell ill, I sat by his bedside for nights on end, arranging his pillows when he drifted into fever dreams. I called specialists, negotiated insurance, and managed paperwork. And when he passed, I carried his ashes to their final resting place, alone, because she and her siblings were too busy to attend. I covered my grief with practicalities, funeral arrangements, thank you notes, estate settlements. No one praised me, no one even thanked me, in the days after the wedding. I returned to my small house on Maplewood Lane. The walls stood in mute. Witnessed to 10 years of silence punctuated only by holiday cards and awkward phone calls. I unpacked the suitcase she had finally sent, filled with dust-gathered souvenirs, a mismatched set of photographs, a half-used bottle of my favorite lavender oil, and a note in her fine looping script. Sorry I couldn't be there, no apology. No acknowledgement of the moment she broke me. I wandered through rooms that once brimmed with memories, her kindergarten paintings taped to the fridge, the books we read together on rainy afternoons. Each object felt heavy with the weight of what I had given and what I had lost. I opened the drawer where I kept birthday cards from the grandchildren and found one unopened, a pink envelope addressed in my daughter's handwriting. Inside, a drawing of our family at last Christmas. I placed it in the window to catch the morning light, as if to prove I had existed in her mind at some point. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. Steam curled up like soft excuses. I did not cry. Instead, I catalogued every kindness unreturned, the nights I read by lantern light so she wouldn't be afraid. The weeks I cared for her sick husband even after I was exhausted. The tears I swallowed when her baby was born without a word of congratulations from her. They had all slipped through my fingers like fine sand running toward the sea. That evening, I took out my ledger, my habit from years of managing household budgets, and I listed every expense, every errand, every silent prayer I had offered for their happiness. On the left side, birthday cake ingredients, $25, $50, chauffeur's tip for the hospital visit, $10, tuition paid in advance, $4,500, phone bills for calls unanswered, $200. On the right side, a single line, acknowledgement, none. Beneath it, a dash of finality. I realized then that gratitude is not owed, but respect is earned, and theirs had evaporated like morning mist. I poured out the last drops of tea, washed the cup, and set it to dry. I felt neither bitterness nor regret. I felt lighter. That night I lay in bed, listening to the soft tick of the mantel clock. I thanked it for its steady rhythm, for reminding me that time moves forward whether we like it or not. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a life unburdened by their indifference, a life shaped by my own choices, my own quiet dignity. Tomorrow I will begin anew. Perhaps I will travel south to visit the coast, where the gulls will overhead and the salt air cleanses old wounds. Perhaps I will rejoin the book club I abandoned, or volunteer at the shelter down the road. I might even take painting lessons, though I haven't held a brush since I was 30. All of it feels possible, unclaimed by their indifference. I am Eleanor Hayes, 74. And today I am not a burden or an embarrassment. I am simply me. I remember the morning light slanting through the kitchen window as I stood at the stove, whisk in hand, stirring oatmeal sweetened with honey and cinnamon. It was Thanksgiving. And the house smelled like roasted turkey and nutmeg. My granddaughter, barely 5 at the time, sat at the table, her legs swinging. I cut her pancake into neat shapes, hearts, stars, because I believed that small gestures could fill up a child's heart. Later, I drove her to ballet lessons, braving rush hour traffic, and arrived just in time to watch her tiptoe across the studio floor. I clapped soft applause, hiding the ache in my back that followed me like a shadow, and when she beamed, I felt every bruise and strain in my body dissolve. All those years, I kept a careful ledger in my mind, diapers changed, fevers soothed, scraped knees kissed. I remember the evenings spent teaching my daughter algebra at the dining table, paper strewn with numbers and half-erased equations. I brewed chamomile tea when she stayed up late studying for exams, poured it into her chipped mug, and listened as she paced, reciting formulas until her voice trembled with exhaustion. I never once complained about lost sleep. Instead, I listened, because I believed that being heard was one of the greatest gifts I could give. When bills came due, mortgage, car repairs, unexpected medical tests, I found ways to cover them. I clipped coupons, hunted sales, and negotiated payment plans with earnest apologies. I took on extra shifts at the bookstore on Saturdays, shelving volumes of dusty poetry and worn detective novels, so I could slip ₹100 note into an envelope marked college fund. I watched the toll it took. My hands grew rough and cracked, my knees protested with every step, and still I kept going. Because the thought of seeing their dreams unfold felt more vital than my own comfort. There were days when the refrigerator hummed empty, and I stood in the doorway, shopping bag in hand, scanning aisles for clearance items. I selected canned goods and frozen vegetables, then picked up fresh bread and a slab of cheese they loved. At checkout, I felt a pang of shame paying with doubloons of coupons and discounted items, but I refused to let them see my pride waver. I carried it all home, unloaded bags, and arranged the contents as if setting the table for royalty, because at that moment they were royalty in my eyes. I kept secrets for them. 2. The letters from college admissions offices stating regretfully, "We cannot offer you." I stuffed those into a drawer and told them that the state university had accepted their applications. I swallowed the knot in my throat when they proclaimed, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom," because I believed their success was mine. I never corrected them. Instead, I smiled and said, "You're strong, you earned it." And in those moments, I felt my own spirit swell, tethered to their triumphs. When my husband's health failed, I became a nurse, caregiver, and advocate. I held his frail hand through sleepless nights in the hospital, read him passages of poetry to ease his fear, and negotiated with doctors until the drips and medications aligned with his fragile constitution. I watched his eyes, once sharp and confident, grow dim with fatigue. I brushed his hair, tenderly, as though the simple gesture might weave new strength into his bones. When he passed, I handled every detail: funeral arrangements, memorial notices, thank you cards, because I knew the proper way to honor a life. And I believed it was my duty to make his final farewell as dignified as our life together had been. I cleaned bedrooms, ironed clothes, and kept the house spotless so they could focus on their own lives without worrying about laundry piles or dusty corners. I mended socks with tiny, secret stitches that almost disappeared into the fabric. I matched buttons, replaced zippers, and hemmed skirts that were too long. Each stitch was a promise. No matter how far they roamed, this house, this mother, would always be here to keep them afloat. I planned family vacations, borrowed maps, researched trains and buses, and booked modest guest houses by telephone. I packed suitcases with extra socks, raincoats, and snacks for hungry children. I watched the sunlight dance on their faces as they spotted the sea for the first time, and I carried inside me the memory of their laughter. I stored that laughter in a jar in my heart, believing that one day I would revisit it when the nights grew long and silent. All this I did without complaint. I never said, "Why me?" or "When will you repay me?" because this was not a ledger of debts, but a journal of love. I believed these acts were the essence of motherhood and grandmotherhood, and yet, as the years passed, each quiet kindness was met with less gratitude. Cards arrived late, phone calls were brief, visits grew infrequent. The smiles that once lit their faces when they saw me now flickered and vanished, replaced by polite nods and the glare of a smartphone screen. In the attic, I found a box labeled Memories. Inside were gifts I had given, a porcelain figurine of 2 doves, a music box that played lullabies, a framed photograph of me holding my granddaughter on her first day of school. I traced my finger over the chipped bird's wing and felt the weight of absence. I realized then that the generosity of my soul had become invisible, so ordinary, so expected, that it no longer counted, and in that realization, a subtle sadness bloomed. Like a rose in winter, beautiful, quiet, and tinged with frost, in the months after I discovered that gratitude could vanish as easily as footprints on sand, I began to notice the subtle shifts, the dinner invitations that never arrived, the unreturned phone calls that flicked off before I could finish "Hello, it's me." I remembered dialing my daughter's number on Sunday afternoons, only to hear the hollow beeps of voicemail, her voice greeting strangers instead of me. I sat by the window, phone pressed to my ear, waiting for the tiny click that signaled she had listened, but it never came. I recalled the day I drove 70 kilometers to her apartment for her birthday lunch, carrying a homemade quiche wrapped in linen, the crust golden and fragrant. I rang the bell, heart fluttering with anticipation of warm hugs and laughter. Instead, the door opened just a crack. Her eyes flickered across me, quiet shock, perhaps embarrassment. She smiled politely, stepped back, and said, "Come inside," but her tone carried distance. I placed the quiche on the counter, its steam rising like an apology, and we sat at opposite ends of the table, eating in silence as her husband scrolled through his phone. I thought of all the times I had knelt in front of that oven, adjusting the heat so the quiche wouldn't burn, imagining her delight at my handiwork. That day, the quiche sat cold and untouched for minutes I could count, but dared not. At last, she ate a slice, offered me a thin smile, and excused herself to take a call. I finished my piece alone and left without farewells, the quiche box still half full in the passenger seat, its fragrant promise unclaimed. Small things chipped away at me. Like raindrops eroding stone, I noticed the library books I sent her. Novels I had chosen for her tastes, their pages lined with yellowed sticky notes and gentle encouragement. They arrived back weeks later, dog-eared but unopened, tucked into a package marked with a distant thanks, the notes I had written in the margins. I loved this. Remember when you were left behind, as if I had never penned them. Family celebrations became a field of landmines. At each gathering, I scanned the crowd for her smile, only to be met with polite nods from acquaintances who barely knew my name. I found myself seated at the edge of the room, where the light was dimmer, the music muffled. In those shadowed corners, I felt the cold press of isolation, as though I wore a cloak of neglect so heavy that it muted my voice and blurred my presence. I remember the first holiday without an invitation, Christmas dinner at her in-laws' house. I baked sugar cookies and strung paper garlands for our own mantel, inhaling the scent of cinnamon and pine. I placed a single candle in the window, a beacon for her return, but the wick burned down to nothing. Night after night, I sat alone by the window, staring at the meagre glow of streetlights, reminding myself that hope need not be loud to be alive, and yet love can be stubborn. I continued sending gifts, a scarf in her favorite shade of blue, a framed photograph of our family at last summer's reunion, a playlist of songs I thought she might enjoy. Each package set out on its journey with the same care I had once lavished on her, but they returned to me like wayward birds, their soft bundles of disappointment cradled in cardboard nests. One day, I found an envelope tucked behind the sofa, an invitation to her son's birthday party, dated 2 weeks past. The card lay face down, its edges curled with neglect. I flipped it over and saw their neat handwriting. "Please join us." I folded the card, pressed it flat, and fired off a polite RSVP by email. Asking if I could still come, the reply was gentle, almost regretful. "I'm sorry, we sent too many invites, perhaps next time." No apology for the oversight, just a casual dismissal that cut deeper than any harsh word. In quiet moments, I catalogued these injuries, the unresolved RSVPs, the folded invitations, the voicemail silences. I kept them in a mental album titled Quiet Hurts. Each hurt labeled with a date and a weight: January 14th, phone unanswered; February 2nd, invitation lost; March 8th, message deleted. I carried that album everywhere, in the grocery line. I pictured its pages fluttering between cereal boxes, on solitary walks. Its photos pressed against my chest like love letters. I noticed the controlling gestures disguised as concern, calls that began with "I just want to make sure you're okay," but ended with orders: "Take your medication. Don't drive in the dark. Come live with us." Each admonition felt less like love and more like shackles on my autonomy. I thought of my days in the hospital last year, recuperating from a minor fall. I refused the offer to move in. Insisted on my own place, my own independence. In their eyes, my choice was irrational. They feared for me, but I feared losing myself even more. I watched from afar as her children flourished. School plays, soccer matches, science fairs. I applauded every milestone through the cold screen of Facebook photos. Each smile and medal a reminder of my absence. I liked the pictures, left heart emojis, and whispered congratulations into the emptiness of my living room. No one thanked me. No one even noticed. Sometimes I caught glimpses of my reflection in shop windows' stooped shoulders. Silver strands of hair, eyes lined with the roadmap of a hard life. In those moments, I saw both fragility and strength, a woman who had given everything and had little left to show. I closed my eyes and breathed in the grit of the pavement, willing myself to remember that I was more than a tally of unreturned favors. In the pattern of neglect, I found a strange clarity. Each unmet expectation illuminated my worth. If they had taken nothing for granted, they would have held me closer instead. They let me drift into the margins, paler than a faint pencil stroke on bright paper, and in that paleness, I learned that absence can speak louder than presence. The space I left behind became the mirror they refused to look into. At night, I drifted into dreams where I whispered to them, "I love you," words that once carried the weight of oceans, now feather light, barely reaching their ears. I awoke with my throat raw, a silent echo of every unspoken truth I had stored like treasure in my chest. I pressed my hand to my heart and felt its steady pulse, reminding me that life still beat within me, despite their indifference. So I gathered my quiet hurts like pebbles for an artful mosaic, not to relieve pain, but to honor it. Each fragment glinted with memory, the unopened letters, the cancelled visits, the whispers of pity disguised as love, and in the gathering, I discovered a truth I had almost forgotten, that my story pressed into the grain of my days was worth telling, even if no one else cared to listen. I remember the exact moment I realized something had shifted irreparably. It was a Thursday morning, June 19th, 2025, when I stepped onto the porch to collect the day's mail. The late spring air was cool, scented with budding jasmine, and the world felt uncommonly still in the stack of envelopes, bills, a grocery flyer. My granddaughter's postcard from summer camp was a heavy, cream-coloured envelope embossed with the registry office crest. My name was typed neatly on the front. I turned it over in my hands, heart fluttering with both anticipation and dread. Inside lay a single sheet of paper folded with precision. I unfolded it and read words that knocked the breath from my lungs. I, Margaret Hayes, hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils and appoint my daughter, Lydia Whittaker, sole executor and beneficiary of my estate. Beneath her signature was a second scrawl, Eleanor Hayes, my name, signed in my own flowing hand, as a witness. The date read June 10th, 2025, 9 days before the wedding she barely acknowledged. I blinked, rereading each line as though the paper might dissolve and leave me with nothing but daylight and jasmine in that moment. The ledger in my mind, the careful account of every act of love I had given, flipped unbearably against the ledger of my losses. All the unpaid bills, the meals left in half-empty containers, the phone calls unanswered, they had finally been tallied and found me wanting. Even my name was reduced to witness only. A signature to validate someone else's design, that single line, sole executor and beneficiary, severed every thread of obligation I once believed bound them to me. My hands trembled as I refolded the document and tucked it inside the envelope. I closed my eyes, listening to the sudden roar of silence. The world beyond the porch seemed to hold its breath. A hummingbird paused mid-hover, the jasmine petals stilled on their slender stems. It felt as though the earth itself had leaned in to hear how I would respond. But I said nothing. I carried the envelope inside and laid it on the kitchen table, its edges catching sunlight like a cut glass shard. I stared at it, imagining the journey it took, hands at the registry office lifting it, a clerk stamping it, envelopes sealed and driven along dusty roads. Each step had brought it closer, each signature had bound my fate without my knowledge. I felt the weight of those miles pressing down on me, a burden I had never agreed to bear. In the quiet that followed, memories surfaced like gilded embers. I remembered helping Margaret, my sister, with her taxes when she lost her husband, guiding her through grief with gentle counsel. I remembered listening to Lydia's hopes for a career in architecture, staying up late to prove her portfolio. I remembered the day she graduated and hugged me so tightly her tears dampened my coat. I had been the witness to their beginnings, and now I was witness only to their denial of me. I thought of the years I had poured into the family home, painting walls, gardening borders, shingling the roof, and how easily those bricks and beams could slip beyond my reach. I saw the porch where I had rocked my granddaughter to sleep on warm summer nights, the kitchen where I taught her to stir batter, the mantel where I displayed photographs of birthdays and anniversaries. All of it could vanish as if built from sand. The betrayal cut deeper because it was legal, sanctioned by ink and seal. There could be no denying it. I could not argue with sentiment or reason. The courts recognized only signatures and dates. I carried the envelope to my study, sank into the wingback chair, and placed it on my lap. I did not weep. Instead, I felt the quiet fracture of my world widen until it swallowed entire years of devotion. I rose and moved to the window, gazing out as sunlight danced across the lawn. The trees whispered in a gentle breeze, oblivious to my unraveling. I watched a single leaf spiral earthward, turning in slow arcs before it settled on the grass. It seemed to say that even the strongest branches must release what they cannot sustain. I pressed my forehead to the glass and felt a curious calm, like the moment before a storm, when the air holds its breath. In the days that followed, I reviewed every document I had ever signed: bank authorizations, medical consents, power of attorney, forms. I found nothing that could overturn the registry office decree. I called the lawyer who had drafted my own will years ago and asked for advice. He spoke in gentle, clipped tones about contesting the will, forging new documents, and the timeline for probate, but each suggestion felt like sailing against an inexorable tide. I thanked him, promising to consider his counsel, and closed my eyes, feeling the ache of lines drawn far beyond my control. I sat at the kitchen table late into the night, the paper envelope still before me. Illuminated by the lone lamp, I ran my finger along the embossed crest, tracing its curves as though I could relearn its contours. I recalled the day I had stood in the registry office to register Margaret's birth, proudly presenting my sister to the world, who had witnessed that moment, who had witnessed the years I spent guiding her. No one had handed me a similar parchment then, and yet they had entrusted me with their trust, and now they had revoked it. That afternoon, I carried the envelope back outside. I walked to the garden shed and retrieved my pruning shears. With methodical precision, I cut a slender branch from the jasmine vine, its blooms trembling on their stems. I took the branch and returned to the porch, set the envelope on the railing, and laid the vine across it. Then I lifted the shears and snipped through paper and petals, severing the envelope in two. The cream-coloured halves fell to the steps, scattering blossoms like pale confetti. I watched them flutter to the ground, each petal a testament to something once beautiful and now broken. I stood there for a long moment, silent, watching the fragments drift. The jasmine petals lost their fragrance in the breeze, and the envelope scraps lay sodden with dew. I felt neither satisfaction nor relief, only the deep, clear water of acceptance. I did not reclaim the document. I did not gather its pieces. I simply let it lie where it fell. In that act so simple, so quiet, I discovered my own final line. I would not fight with ink or petition the courts. I would not stoop to plead or bargain for scraps. I would cut my own ties with as much grace as I could muster. The registry office could decree what they would, but they could not claim my spirit. They could remove my name from their list of heirs, but they could never erase the sum of my life's devotion. I turned from the railing and walked back into the house. Jasmine vines swaying in the breeze, the world had shifted, but I felt a steadiness bloom within me, like a seed buried in winter soil waiting to sprout. I placed my hands on the front door and paused, feeling the grain of the wood, the pulse of its threshold. Then I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me, as though sealing off a chapter that no longer served me, and in that gentle click, I knew I would write the next line of my story on my own terms. For days after I severed the jasmine-clad envelope, I carried a quietness with me like a cloak woven from dusk. I spoke only when necessary, to greet the postman, to order groceries, to tell the cat that evening meal was served. My voice felt unfamiliar in my own throat, as though I were speaking through layers of gauze. Silence, I discovered, can be its own language: a pointed glance, a measured step, the stillness of an unasked question. I began withdrawing from routines. I stopped sending gifts and placing phone calls on Sundays. When the mail arrived, I left it piled on the kitchen table: bills, flyers, an occasional postcard from a distant cousin. I did not open cards from my daughter or grandchildren. I did not delete voicemails or return messages. Instead, I listened to their recorded tones leak into my mind, hesitant, perfunctory, lacking warmth. And then I pressed delete, as if each deletion were a small rite of reclamation. In the hush of that withdrawal, I found space to think. I sat in my study, sunlight drifting across the worn leather of my armchair, and I emptied the contents of my purse onto the desk: keys, the gold locket my husband gave me on our 50th anniversary, a small notebook filled with grocery lists and doctor appointments. I opened the notebook and turned to blank pages. There, I began a different ledger, not of expenses or unreturned favours, but of possibilities. I wrote down dreams I had abandoned painting, classes in the village hall, a week's retreat at the lakeside cottage, a quiet trip to Lahore to see the old part of the city. Each idea felt like a promise to myself, an affirmation that I still had desires beyond their neglect. I looked back at the registry office decree and realized it hung over me like a dark cloud. But I refused to be consumed by it. Instead, I researched quietly. I sat at my computer, poring over legal websites and probate guides. I bookmarked articles about contesting wills, drafting codicils, and gaining power of attorney. I scribbled notes in the margins: consult Ms. Malik. Family law, inquire about mediation, check statute of limitations. I did not share these notes with anyone. I filed them away in a folder I labelled my affairs, a title that felt both novel and liberating. I began saving. I opened a new bank account, one that bore my name only. I transferred small amounts each week from my old account, money earned from a freelance editing project, dividends from a long-forgotten investment, the interest on a fixed deposit. I watched the balance grow, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 rupees. With each deposit, I felt the soft tightening of control around my life, as though I were gathering strength for a journey I had not yet named. At the end of the week, I made an appointment with Ms. Farah Malik, a family law attorney recommended by a neighbour. I stepped into her office, a bright room hung with diplomas, and introduced myself as Eleanor Hayes. I explained, in calm, measured sentences, the betrayal of the will. I spoke of my age, my health, and my desire not for vengeance, but for recognition and respect. Ms. Malik listened without interruption, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. When I finished, she looked up with clear eyes and said, "We have options," and laid out a path of contestation, mediation, and, if necessary, litigation. I thanked her and left with a folder of documents and a head full of legal terms: undue influence, testamentary capacity, probate court. On the way home, I stopped at the market and bought ingredients to make dal and chapati simple, fair but nourishing. I chopped vegetables in the bright afternoon light and let the aroma fill my kitchen. Cooking felt like prayer, each stir of the spoon a mindful act of self-care. I ate alone at the table, savouring each bite, noticing the texture of the lentils and the warmth of the flatbread. I felt myself returning to my body, present and alive. Over the next fortnight, I settled into my silence. I did not attend the granddaughter's recital, though she had personally invited me. I did not reply to texts asking if I was all right. Instead, I spent afternoons in the garden, pruning the roses and deadheading the marigolds. I walked down Maplewood Lane at dawn. The world hushed except for the distant crow of a rooster or the whistle of a passing train. In the quiet, I wrote letters I did not intend to send, to my daughter, listing the ways she had hurt me, to my granddaughter, telling her of the pancakes I once shaped into stars, to my late husband, thanking him for teaching me love. Each letter was folded and placed into the My Affairs folder, a testament to my truth. I discovered a new rhythm: breakfast with chai on the porch, a morning spent reading legal briefs, an afternoon of gardening, an evening listening to classical music while I wrote in my notebook. I reconnected with friends whose voices offered empathy without judgment. I met with Ms. Malik again, signed documents, and learned that contesting a will could take months, perhaps years, but that the process itself was empowering. Each signature was a declaration I mattered, and I had the right to claim my place. In that silence, I realized that my absence was my most potent statement. They searched for me in the grooves of their lives, looking for the hands that once folded laundry, the voice that once offered comfort. They might not summon me with calls or invitations, but the emptiness I left behind spoke louder than any argument I might make. Silence became my sword, forging distance that clarified my worth. One morning, I found an email from Lydia, marked urgent. My heart fluttered, and I resisted the urge to open it immediately. Instead, I finished my coffee, washed the cup, and sat in my armchair. I read her message. "Mother, I'm sorry. We were wrong. Can we talk?" The words were simple, but they trembled with possibility. I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the silence deepen. I did not reply. I did not delete. I waited, holding my breath in the calm between heartbeats. I had gone silent not to punish them, but to protect myself in that stillness. I found space to breathe, to heal, to remember who I was outside there. Expectations. I learned that silence can carve out a sanctuary where one's own voice, long drowned in the demands of others, can finally be heard. And in that voice, I discovered a new resolve. I would speak when I was ready, on my own terms, and with the quiet confidence of a woman who had reclaimed her own story. After weeks of careful planning and quiet preparation, I took my first decisive step. I rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, a place with pale yellow shutters and a creaking porch swing that whispered welcome in the breeze. It was modest to rooms, a kitchenette, and a narrow brick pathway leading to a rosebush, but it was mine. I arrived on a damp Tuesday morning, June 30th, 2025. With a single suitcase and a folder labelled my affairs. As I turned the key in the lock, I felt a thrill of possibility unfurl like morning light across the walls. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and fresh paint. I moved slowly from room to room, running my fingertips along the plaster, imagining how I would arrange my books, where I might place the armchair for reading, and which corner would hold my easel. I realized this space reflected me in varnished and simple, yet brimming with potential. I set down the folder on the small dining table and exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. That exhale carried the weight of decisions made. To contest the will, to save each rupee, to redefine my life. It felt like the first note of a new melody. Over the following days, I settled into routines that felt wholly my own. Each morning, I made a pot of strong tea and sat on the porch swing, inhaling the scent of honeysuckle from the garden next door. I wrote in my notebook dreams, plans, poems without constraint or fear of interruption. I sketched the rosebush in charcoal, noticing how its petals curled in the sun. These small acts nurtured a sense of belonging I had not felt in years. I met with Ms. Malik in her office twice more. We filed the petition to contest the will, gathered witness statements, and prepared for mediation. Each signature I placed on the documents was an affirmation I mattered. I watched as my savings account dwindled with legal fees, but I did not flinch. I had traded the illusion of unconditional family allegiance for the certainty of self-respect. Within me, a quiet confidence took root, steady as the courthouse columns. Meanwhile, I discovered a windfall I had forgotten, a government savings bond my late husband purchased when I turned 60. T matured to a modest sum enough to cover my rent for the next year. I travelled by bus to the central bank, presented the certificate, and received a cheque in my name. Holding that cheque, I felt the tangible result of decades of prudent saving and foresight. I tucked it into my folder, alongside the mediation paperwork. As if both were trophies of my own resourcefulness, I also reconnected with an old friend, Sheila, whom I had not seen since our children were in primary school together. We met for lunch at a tea house overlooking a lotus pond. Sheila listened as I told her of the silent betrayal, of the contested will, and of this cottage sanctuary. She did not offer pity instead. She offered solidarity. "You deserve peace, Eleanor," she said, and we toasted to new beginnings with frothy glasses. Her friendship became a balm, reminding me that a chosen family can be as meaningful as Any blood tie. At home, I began painting again. I set up my easel by the window and worked in oils, blending bold strokes of cobalt and amber to capture the sky at dusk. I lost myself in colour, in the tactile feel of brush against canvas, in the gradual emergence of a landscape that mirrored my inner horizon, with each painting. I reclaimed a piece of the self that had been relegated to the margins of others' lives. In the evenings, I read by lamplight legal guides, poetry anthologies, travel essays. I planned a pilgrimage to Lahore, imagining wandering through the winding streets of the old city, tasting hulwa puri on a bustling morning, and standing before the Badshahi Mosque at sunset. I wrote itineraries, bookmarked guest houses, and practiced adieu phrases in my notebook. The trip felt like an anchor for my newfound agency, a future destination that beckoned with promise. Throughout it all, I maintained the silence I had chosen. I did not tell my daughter about the cottage. I did not update her on the legal proceedings. When a distant relative inquired about my well-being, I replied simply, "I'm doing what I need to do." Those words carried no apology, only a measured declaration of autonomy. One day, a notice arrived for mediation. July 20th, I placed it on the kitchen counter beside a vase of wildflowers I had picked from the roadside. I imagined the meeting room, polished table, tall windows, the lawyer's calm presence. I felt neither dread nor triumph, only readiness. I would walk into that room as the same woman who had baked quiches and arranged birthday flowers, but also as the woman who knew her worth and would not be understated. Late at night, when the moonlight sifted through the shutter slats, I sat on the porch swing with a shawl around my shoulders. I watched fireflies drift above the rosebush and thought of the jasmine envelope I had cut in two. I felt no regret for letting go of that chapter. Instead, I felt gratitude for the clarity it had given me, that I could move differently, guided by my own compass. As the days shortened and the monsoon clouds gathered, I realized how much I had grown. The silence that once felt empty now felt full of purpose, full of vision, in the half-light before dawn. I whispered to the night, "I am enough." And the cottage replied with creaks of welcome, and in that whispered exchange, I understood that moving differently was not an act of rebellion, but of love for the person I was rediscovering and the life I was crafting with my own steady hands. In the weeks after I settled into the cottage and filed for mediation, I watched their lives carry on without my presence and discovered the depth of what they had forfeited. It began with subtle ripples. My daughter sent a text asking for help balancing her checkbook, but then realized she could not recall the password to the joint account we once shared. I watched as she reset it twice and finally gave up, muttering about old procedures too complicated to bother with. I imagined her frustration mounting as she pieced together figures in her head, wishing for the patient guidance I used to offer. At the mediation meeting on July 20th, when we sat across from each other in the sunlit conference room, I heard Lydia apologize for her abruptness at the wedding. Her voice shook. Not with fear, but with recognition of her own missteps. She spoke of missed birthdays, forgotten anniversaries, and nights when she should have called but drifted to sleep instead. I listened as she detailed the gaps I had left in their lives, the meals unsent in the mail, the calls never made, the wise counsel they no longer heard. In that space, I realized that my absence had carved a void so palpable it echoed between the walls. After mediation, small truths surfaced in the days that followed. My daughter struggled with a faulty washing machine and admitted she couldn't remember how to replace the belt. She searched online for tutorials but balked at the technical jargon. She called a repairman at double the cost rather than ask a friend she once confided in. I thought of the afternoons I spent in the basement teaching her to unbolt panels and thread spare parts, her hands small against the oily gears. Now, she paid for convenience that once took only a gentle hand and gentle words. An email arrived From a neighbour near the old family home, the front gate was sagging, the ivy had climbed unchecked, and the mailbox post leaned at a precarious angle. "We thought you might want to know," it read politely, as though my name and address were vestiges of a life already past. I pictured the white gate, its hinges squeaking under the weight of overgrowth, and remembered how I used to oil them each autumn. I remembered the ritual of sweeping leaves in a neat arc, collecting them in brown bags, and stacking them for compost. Now, the garden gate would groan each time it opened, a lament for the hands that once cared for it. On a quiet evening, I received a voicemail from my granddaughter, her voice hesitant. "Nana, I lost my favorite blue scarf. Do you know where it is?" I smiled at the memory of knitting that scarf by the fireplace, row upon row of cable stitch. The soft wool warmed by my fingertips. I traced the stitch pattern in my mind, imagining how easy it would be to fashion another, but I stayed silent, letting her ask her mother for help. I pictured her trail of questions, the inevitable glance at her mother's tired eyes, and the regret that flickered there when she realized she had no one to call. I began to understand that they had lost more than practical assistance. They had lost the quiet assurance of my presence in her new house. My daughter commissioned an interior decorator instead of asking for my thoughts on curtains and cushions. When the decorator's bill arrived, she winced at the expense, but told herself it was worth a professional touch. I remembered the afternoons we spent at the fabric store together, comparing swatches and debating textures until we both fell silent, content in each other's company. Those returning silences were neither force nor distance, they were companionable pauses that spoke of trust and intimacy. A friend visited me in the cottage one afternoon. Carrying photographs on her phone, she scrolled through images of a family reunion at the old home, laughter frozen in pixels, my grandchildren chasing chickens in the yard, my daughter trying to coax a reluctant niece into a group portrait. She paused on a picture of the dining room table set for dinner, its spotless tablecloth waiting for my handiwork, the centerpiece of fresh lilies, the cutlery aligned just so. Everything looked perfect, my friend said, but it wasn't quite the same. I knew what she meant. The table held itself together, but lacked the gentle orchestration I had provided, the small details that transformed a meal into a memory. During a phone call with my former next-door neighbor, I learned that the traffic cones blocking the old driveway had remained in place for days because no one knew where to store them after roadwork. They had sat forlorn, cones unstacked and upright, like silent sentinels marking absence. I remembered retrieving those cones with my daughter's help one summer afternoon, stacking them beneath the shed and hosing off the mud. We had laughed at the absurdity of ourselves, two women in summer dresses handling road equipment, and in that laughter I felt the warmth of our bond. Now the cones stood abandoned, their bright orange dulled by dust. Even the family dog, old Rufus, wandered in circles by the gate, nose to the ground. Searching for the scent of my slippers in the entryway, my daughter texted a picture of him with a question mark emoji, and I replied, "He misses me." But no one came to reassure Rufus with a gentle pat or a biscuit. They took him for walks mechanically, along routes straighter and shorter than the meandering paths I favoured. I pictured Rufus tasting the air for traces of my lavender perfume, and finding only hints of street traffic and fertilizer. The deepest ache was in the absence of my voice. No one asked me to read aloud from the poetry collection I once held at book club meetings. No one sought my counsel on family recipes passed down through generations. I recalled the evening gatherings around the hearth, where I would recite lines of Wordsworth or Rumi, letting my voice rise and fall like candlelight. Now the hearth sat cold, its embers banked with memories no longer stirred by my breath. Yet, in that void, I felt a quiet power. They had become aware, perhaps for the first time, of the scaffolding I had provided for their lives, the missing balance sheets, the faltering appliances, the neglected garden all bore witness to my absence. And in witnessing that absence, they glimpsed the breadth of my contributions. They had lost more than a helping hand. They had lost a presence that quietly held their world together. One morning, I received a letter from my daughter. She wrote, "I realize how much I took for granted. I'm sorry, I miss your voice in my life." There were no demands, no entreaties, just an acknowledgement that the world had shifted in my absence. I folded the letter and placed it in the folder labeled My Affairs. I did not unfold it again. I did not reply immediately. Instead, I sat in the early sun on my porch swing and listened to the wind in the rosebush, the steady hum of a cicada hidden among the leaves. In that moment, I felt the gentle weight of their recognition, and it settled in me like a soft offering. I did not rush back into their lives. I watched the gates being repaired, the garden being pruned, the appliances tended by a newly hired handyman. I noted the difference in the way they approached these tasks, awkward, deliberate, as though learning a craft from scratch. Each successful repair, each restored routine, felt like a testament to my teaching, evidence that my lessons lingered even in my absence. I realized then that absence had not made the heart grow fonder in easy sentiment. It had shown the heart what truly anchored it. They had learned that a life enriched by quiet devotion need not be loud to be vital, and in that lesson I found a kind of victory not through confrontation, but through the subtle revelation of what they had lost. Late that evening, I closed my eyes and whispered into the stillness, "I was here." The night answered with the rustle of leaves, and I understood that in the hush of absence, my presence had spoken more clearly than any word I could have uttered. I awoke before dawn one morning, the sky still draped in shades of indigo and violet, and carried my notebook and pen to the porch swing. The air was cool, mist pooling at my feet like pale toll. I opened a fresh page and wrote, "Dear Eleanor, the one you are right now." At first, the words felt strange on my lips, as though I were addressing a stranger, but as the pen moved across the paper, tracing each letter, I sensed the weight of lifetimes embedded in my own script. I realized this letter would be both confession and benediction. I paused, listening to the soft lull of my heartbeat and the distant rumble of the early train. In that hush, I found courage. "You have been kind beyond measure," I wrote. "You gave until you had nothing left to give. You have hidden your own needs behind their smiles." The ink pooled slightly at the curve of each G and Y, mirroring the tears that welled in my eyes, but I did not wipe them away. Instead, I let them fall onto the page, smudging the words with gentle compassion. I continued, "Tomorrow you will step into a room that might feel hostile. You will confront words signed in cold ink. You will face the betrayal that severed your place in their world. But know this, your worth is not measured by their acknowledgement." I dipped the pen into the inkwell and wrote those lines slowly, as though each syllable carried a sacred meaning. The early light broke over the rooftops, and I felt as if the sun itself had paused to read alongside me. Then I wrote to my daughter, "My dear Lydia, I know you did not set out to diminish me. The years passed in a blur of obligations, and the quiet kindnesses slipped through your fingers. But I recall every gift I offered, every sacrifice I made, and every time I held your hand when the world felt cold. I believe in the good in your heart." The pen trembled as I penned those words, but I refused to blot them out. Compassion, I realized, could mend fractures that anger only deepened. Next, I addressed my granddaughter, "Sweet Clara, your laughter has been the star I sailed by, even when I felt adrift. I remember the morning I taught you to tie your shoe, guiding your fingers until they understood the loops and knots. If you have forgotten, know that you carry that memory in your bones." I hesitated, recalling the wedding hall where she turned away, but I pressed on, deciding that kindness must arrive before reproach. I added, I will always see the child who needs me, even if you cannot see me now. I folded the page, breathing deeply, and then wrote on a second sheet, to my past self. The woman who worried that her own needs were selfish, they are not. Your dreams are valid, your tears are honest, your heart is vast enough to hold both love and boundaries. You deserve the same compassion you extended to others. The words felt like balm on old scars. I could almost feel the pulse of my younger self in that letter, anxious and hopeful and prone to believing that love requires sacrifice without end. I gathered both sheets and placed them in an envelope stamped with my own careful hand, to be opened when I choose. I set the envelope beside the inkstand. Where the morning light glinted on its edges, I did not seal it immediately, wanting the letter to rest in the half-finished state of becoming. It was a living promise, awaiting the moment when I would truly believe its message. All day, I moved through my routines with a quiet ease. I painted at the easel, each stroke of amber and rose recalling the dawn's clarity. I tended the garden, trimming the jasmine and rosemary, breathing in their fragrant resilience. I practiced adieu phrases for my trip to Lahore, letting the rolling syllables remind me of languages spoken by generations of women before me. Everything felt infused with gentle anticipation, as though the world had tilted slightly in my favor. In the afternoon, I brewed chai and invited Sheila for tea. As we sat on the porch, the envelope between us like a silent guest, I mentioned that I had written letters. Sheila leaned forward, her eyes kind. Will you send them? She asked softly. I shook my head. Not yet, I replied. They are not for them to read. They are for me to own. Sheila nodded, sipping her tea, and I realized that the true audience for this letter was the woman who had been silent for so long. That evening, a soft knock arrived at my door. It was Lydia. She stood in the lamplight, hesitation and resolve mingling on her face. Mother, may I come in? She asked. I led her to the cottage's small sitting room and closed the door behind us. We sat on opposite chairs, the air thick with words unsaid. She reached for my hand and said, I saw your letter by the inkstand. I want to understand. I took a breath and reminded myself of the letter's purpose. It was my gift to myself, but I could share its contents if I chose. I rose, retrieved the envelope, and handed it to her. Read it when you're ready, I said. Her fingers trembled as she held it, and I understood that healing often arrives on its own timeline. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and left without further words. The moon was high when I returned to the porch, the rosebush petals silvered by starlight. I clasped my hands over my heart and felt its steady, triumphant beat. In the solitude of that night, I realized that the letter had already transformed me. It had carved a space where love and compassion could coexist with boundaries and self-respect. It showed me that writing to one's own soul could be as vital as any conversation with others. And as I rose to close my notebook, I whispered into the quiet, I am free. The porch swing creaked in gentle agreement, and for the first time in many years I believed it. Morning light filters through the lace curtains, painting the cottage walls in soft gold. I rise slowly, arms reaching outward, as if greeting a dear friend. My body moves with calm deliberation. I stretch, slip into my robe, and step onto the porch. The rose bush I pruned weeks ago now blooms in cheerful clusters, each petal edged with dew. I pause to inhale their fragrance, allowing the gentle sweetness to settle in my chest like a remembered lullaby. I carry a cup of chai to the swing, settling in with legs tucked beneath me. The air is still, broken only by the distant twitter of sparrows. I open my notebook to a fresh page and write a single line. I am here, fully present. Then I close the book and sip my tea. The warmth travels down my throat, and I feel the pulse of gratitude in each heartbeat. Today, I have no appointments, No obligations. In the past, that would have felt like an empty stretch of ours. Now, I welcome the space to simply be. I step into the garden and tend the herbs mint, basil, rosemary, pinching off spent flowers and watching new shoots emerge. Each snip of the shears is rhythmic, like a slow drumbeat guiding me deeper into the moment. I collect fragrant sprigs in a woven basket, planning to dry them for tea when the seasons turn. Inside, I hang laundry on the line, soft cotton sheets, linen napkins, my favorite shawl of pale grey wool. The linens flare in the breeze, and I imagine them drifting like sails across an open sea. In that vision, I feel the weight of my past burdens lifting, billowing away like discarded canvas. I step back and breathe in the fresh breeze, anchored by the simple act of caring for my home. Mid-morning, I walk to the village market along a shaded lane. The vendors greet me by name. The greengrocer offers extra tomatoes. The baker wraps a warm loaf in brown paper. The florist tucks a sprig of jasmine into my basket for the scent it brings. No one hurries me, no one takes my presence for granted. Each interaction is its own small ceremony, reminding me that kindness need not be grand to be profound. Returning home, I prepare lunch, lentil soup with spinach, warm flatbread, and a salad of cucumber and mint. I set the table for one, arranging the dishes on a simple wooden tray. I light a single candle and sit with my back straight, eating slowly and mindfully. Each spoonful is a meditation. The earthy warmth of lentils, the cool crispness of greens, the soft chew of bread, I taste each flavor fully, as though discovering them for the first time. After lunch, I move to my easel and continue a painting. Begun last week, a view of the courtyard at sunset, the sky awash in lavender and rose. My brush glides across the canvas, laying down colors that pulse with life. I work in silence, listening only to the whispered rhythm of paint on canvas. When I step back to survey my progress, I feel both delight and a reminder that creation can soothe the soul. Late afternoon, I returned to my notebook and wrote a few lines about the day, the bloom of roses, the kindness of neighbors, the taste of soup. I write with honesty, noting moments of joy and subtle aches of memory. I do not censor myself. Each word is a testament to the full tapestry of my life, light and shadow woven together. As dusk falls, I light the lantern by the porch swing and settle in with a book of poetry. I read a few lines aloud, letting the cadence of the words echo in the quiet air. Then I close the book and watch the lantern flame flicker, its glow steady and small. I reflect on the journey that brought me here, the moments of deep hurt, the brave steps of silence, the reclamation of self. Each milestone has led to this evening of quiet contentment. Before bed, I stand at the window and look out at the night sky. Stars gleam like distant promises, and I feel the vastness of the universe cradling my small world. I whisper a soft gratitude for every hardship that taught me resilience, every absence that revealed my strength, and every act of self-love that guided me back to myself. I climb into bed, pulling the quilt up around my shoulders. I close my eyes and allow the hush of the cottage to envelop me. My breath slows, each inhale and exhale a gentle tide washing over me. I rest in the certainty that I have carved a life of my own choosing, rich in purpose and quiet in celebration. Tomorrow, I may tend the garden again, write another letter to my future self, or begin planning that trip to Lahore. But for now, I rest in the stillness, letting the echo of my own presence be the final note in a long symphony. Because I have learned that quiet is not emptiness, it is the space where the soul finds its true voice. I wasn't angry, I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. Morning light spills through the lace curtains, but today it feels different, brighter, more urgent. I awaken with a flutter of anticipation, as though the walls of the cottage itself are urging me onward. I rise and dress quickly, smoothing the creases in my cotton blouse and fastening the pearl buttons with deliberate care. My heart thrums with possibility, a steady drumbeat guiding me toward the day's purpose. I carry my notebook, pen, and a small satchel down the creaky stairs and onto the porch. The rosebush waves its blossoms in silent encouragement. I pause to breathe in its soft fragrance, letting the scent anchor me in the certainty of this moment. Then I sit and write a single line. Today, I begin my journey. I close the book and slide it into my satchel, alongside my passport and a pen-scrawled itinerary for Lahore. The house feels hushed as I pack. I fold my shawl, wrap it carefully around the straps of my leather satchel, and tuck my worn journal between the pages of a poetry anthology. I place a letter sealed and addressed to my future self at the top of my belongings. Inside, I have written words of encouragement and permission to explore, to err, to find joy outside familiar boundaries. I close the envelope and set it in my pocket, a talisman against doubt. Before I leave, I pause in the sitting room, light filtering through the window onto the worn rug. I think of the years I spent here, quiet days of contemplation, evenings of painting and poetry, mornings of chai on the swing. I have lived a lifetime in this cottage, and it has nurtured me through transition and healing. I touch the doorframe gently, as though bidding farewell to an old friend, and whisper, "Thank you." Then I step outside, allowing the door to close softly behind me. The bus stop is a short walk away, down the shaded lane lined with bougainvillea. I inhale the scent of humid air and jasmine, recalling evenings spent writing letters under this same canopy of blooms. When the bus arrives, I climb aboard with a steady step and select a seat by the window as we rumble along. I gaze at the familiar fields and hills receding behind me, folding my hands in my lap and feeling the steady rhythm of the journey beneath me. At the airport, I navigate the bustle with practiced calm. The screens list flights bound for distant cities: Mumbai, Dubai, London, but my eyes seek the one that reads Lahore. I step in line, surrender my documents, and pass through security with only a momentary flutter of nerves. When I arrive at the gate, I find a quiet corner and draw my travel guide across my lap. I review the map of the old city, studying narrow alleys and hidden courtyards, temples and mosques that I will visit, each name Anarkali Bazaar, walled city. Shadara Gate brims with the promise of stories waiting to be told. The flight is long, but I pass the time with poetry and meditation. I close my eyes and imagine walking through Lahore's ancient streets, the call to prayer echoing from minarets, the scent of samosas and cardamom on the breeze. I let my mind wander to the Badshahi Mosque, its domes rising against the sky like ornate teacups, and to the Lahore Fort, where history pulses through carved stone walls. Each vision feels like a thread weaving me into a tapestry of living memory. When the plane descends, I feel my pulse quicken. The city unfolds beneath me, rooftops layered in sunshine, tree-lined avenues, a mosaic of colors and textures. I step onto the tarmac and into a new rhythm, the hum of voices in Urdu, the laughter of children in school uniforms, the rush of rickshaws weaving through traffic. I gather my satchel and move forward, each step a small victory over the doubts that once tethered me to the familiar. In the arrivals hall, I exchange my currency and find the driver holding a sign with my name. He smiles, genuine and warm, and helps me into the car. As we navigate the city's arteries, I press my hand to the window and watch Lahore breathe around me. Bustling markets overflowing with spices, vendors selling jasmine garlands, shop fronts painted in brilliant hues. The driver points out landmarks, the Shalimar Gardens, the tomb of Jandra, and I nod, committing each site to memory. I arrive at the guest house, a restored haveli with carved wooden screens and a courtyard fountain inside. My room awaits, a low bed draped in linen, embroidered. Pillows piled high, a window that opens onto a jasmine-draped balcony. I place my satchel on the bed and breathe deeply, letting the city's pulse sync with my own. Then I step onto the balcony and watch as the sun dips toward the horizon, turning the sky the color of turmeric and rose water. That evening, I wandered to a nearby tea stall where men sip chai over chess boards and women buy sweet jalebi from a street vendor. I order a cup and lean against a low wall, savoring the warmth and the hum of conversation. A young woman at the next table offers me a smile, and we exchange nods to strangers connected by simple kindness. I lift my cup in a silent toast to new friendships yet to bloom. Back at the haveli, I unpack my belongings. I remove the letter to my future self and read it beneath the lamplight. The words I wrote months ago, I see them now as a promise fulfilled. You have permission to seek beauty, to claim your worth, to discover that life's horizon is as wide as your courage. The letter trembles in my hands, and I realize how far I have come. I close my eyes and let the sounds of the night surround me, the distant call to prayer, the murmur of passing traffic, the soft trickle of the courtyard fountain. I feel the weight of past betrayals and silences dissolve into the warm breeze. In their place, a new confidence rises, a belief that I can belong anywhere I choose. That my story is not bound by those who once diminished me. As I climb into bed, the monsoon wind rustles the window screens. I rest my head on the pillow and close my eyes, whispering a final line to the dark. I am both witness and author of my own life. In that moment, I understand that every step, every letter, every quiet act of self-love has led me here to this new horizon where my spirit can soar, and with that realization, I drift into sleep, dreaming of tomorrow's adventures under Lahore's golden sky.